So thanks everyone for joining today's session, and thank you, Manfred, and I'll pass over to Rabbi Chapper soon to officially introduce Manfred to everybody. And as you can tell, today's topic is learning about the Holocaust, and Manfred will talk and answer questions at the end with a slideshow. The next session we're planning is in February, and that will be on charity, tzedakah. And I will send more details as to guest speakers, and the plan will be to have that in Croxdale on a Sunday morning with some speakers about charity, which will be quite an interesting session. And then I think the plan is to have a final session and a presentation in March, but I'll give you more details on that shortly. Well, I'll hand over now to Rabbi Chapper to introduce Manfred to everybody.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan, for organising this very, very important session. We were very privileged last year to hear from Mr. Goldberg about his experiences, and we're delighted he's once again agreed to address our Club 13. We know Holocaust Memorial Day is on Thursday, the 27th of January, and we are privileged and honoured to have Mr. Manfred Goldberg speak to us today. Just a very quick introduction. We're going to hear his life story. Manfred was born in 1930 in Kassel in central Germany into an Orthodox Jewish family. He and his family sadly suffered escalating persecution in Germany under the Nazi regime during the Second World War. Manfred's father was able to escape to Britain in August 1939, just days before the war began, but the rest of the family were unable to join him. We know the situation deteriorated following the outbreak of war, and in 1940, Manfred's Jewish school was closed by the Nazi authorities. In December 1941, Manfred and his mother and younger brother were deported by train from Germany to the Riga ghetto in Latvia. They also went to a number of different concentration camps. Thankfully, they survived. Both his parents also survived the Holocaust as well. Manfred has since then dedicated his life to sharing his life story, his experiences, and he just told us a few moments ago, he feels it's an obligation to explain, to make known what the Holocaust means, but it shouldn't just be seen as an abstract concept, but people should understand exactly what it means. Manfred, we're so delighted to have you here with us once again, and it's going to go over to you. We're really looking forward to hearing your story.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Good morning to you. I would just like to tell you initially that for many years after the liberation, I could not bring myself to speak publicly. I had been asked many times, and it took me decades before I could steel myself to speak about my Holocaust experiences. But since then, I have done my best to educate particularly younger generations, to whom the word Holocaust probably just signifies some dreadful events without actually knowing just what it actually involved. I hope by the end of my talk, you will have some insight into what the Holocaust actually meant to the millions of Jews who were caught up in it. I'm pretty sure that you all know that during the Nazi regime's period in power, 1933 to 45, European Jewry suffered unprecedented persecution amounting to a serious attempt at genocide to murder every Jew the Nazis could lay their hands on. And heartbreakingly, they came close to achieving it. I hope to give you some personal insight into the Holocaust, as I said, but before I actually begin my personal testimony, I would just like to give you some background to the development of the Holocaust. As soon as the Nazis came to power, they began passing a stream of anti-Jewish laws, hundreds of them. I will just list a few to give you some inkling of what Jews had to put up with. They deprived all German Jews, even those who had lived in Germany for generations, of their nationality, which meant they lost all civic rights and the right to vote. They began appropriating Jewish businesses. By 1938, I believe 2/3 of all Jewish businesses had been taken over by force or by threats. In the beginning of 1939, all Jewish children were expelled from schools, and those who attended Jewish schools, their schools were forcibly closed, so there was no education after that for any Jewish child. We were forbidden to enter non-Jewish shops. One shop was designated as the Jews' shop, and that was where we had to do all our shopping. We were forbidden to own a radio, a bicycle. We were forbidden to own a radio, cinema, even sit on a park bench. Every Jew had to wear a yellow star on their outer garment when they were out of doors. It had the word Jew written across it. There were many, many more, but I guess you get the idea. You may have heard of a horrific event which many people believe to be the beginning of the active Holocaust, which occurred on November the 9th, 1938. It is known in German as Kristallnacht. In English, it's called the Night of the Broken Glass. It was a nationally organized orgy to terrorize the Jewish population in Germany. Crowds of people accompanied by in uniform Nazi military personnel and police roamed the streets. They vandalized all the remaining Jewish shops. They also attacked and looted and vandalized completely hundreds of synagogues. And those that were in their own grounds, many were set on fire. In addition, they arrested and sent to concentration camps around 30,000 Jewish men, not the families, just the men. And the height of irony was that after all that, the Nazis blamed the Jews for this horrific event and fined the Jewish community nationally 1 billion German marks. The Nazis still permitted Jews to leave Germany, but only after stripping them of all their material assets. Nevertheless, Jews were so terrorized to leave Germany that they would have gone anywhere penniless, but unfortunately, the world climate towards helping Jews save themselves was total indifference, to such an extent that many Jews paid substantial sums to professional smugglers to guide them across the borders into neighboring countries like France, Belgium, Holland. There they thought they were safe from the Nazis. Sadly, they were mistaken because all these countries were eventually occupied by the Nazis, and the vast majority of these Jews who had fled were rounded up and sent to the death camps. They even held an international conference in 1938, ostensibly to helping Jews leave Germany. They talked for 2 weeks and achieved absolutely nothing. There's even a possibility or even a probability that this public display of indifference towards helping Jews to flee, to save their lives, may have encouraged Hitler, that it was perfectly safe for him to continue planning and establishing his extermination machine to murder the millions of Jews as he intended. It was a public display that the world just didn't care. Nevertheless, quite a number of Jews managed to get out of Germany, but the vast majority were stuck. My parents were on a list to get a visa from the USA, but each time they told me when it came close to success, the American authorities moved the goalpost, made further requirements, and we never made it. As a result of this, I am here today as a Holocaust survivor. Both my parents were born in Poland. They both, as singles, made their way into Germany, where they settled. They married in 1927. I was born in 1930, and the younger brother was born in 1934. Having lived in Germany for more than 20 years, in mid-1939, my father was arrested by the Nazis and was told he was being deported to Poland. The Poles refused to accept him because he had given up his Polish nationality, and so the Nazis scheduled him to be sent to a concentration camp. My mother, Olea Sholem, very courageously actually began pleading with the Nazi authorities for my father's release. But she was told the only possibility would be if he presented a visa permitting him entry into another country, they would allow him to leave, penniless, of course. My mother, Olea Sholem, made desperate efforts to obtain a visa for him and for us, of course. And the Almighty had mercy on her. She finally applied to the British consulate in Berlin, whose chief passport officer was a man with a heart. And he saved, in fact, around 10,000 Jews by issuing transit visas against the wishes of the British government. When he heard my mother's heartbreaking story, he gave her a single visa for my father, permitting him entry to the UK. And he also promised my mother that within a matter of 8 weeks or so, he would be able to issue visas for us to join my father in the UK. Unfortunately, 2 weeks after my father left, the Nazis insisted that he leave within 24 hours, otherwise the deal was off. He was now in the UK and we were trapped in Germany. Life was extremely tough, but we managed to survive. Well, my mother managed to care for us. And at the end, in December 1941, we were arrested, taken to the railway station with 1 suitcase permitted for the 3 of us, where we met a large group of Jews amounting in total to around 1,000. We were packed into a train and set off on a 3-day and night journey into the unknown. When the train stopped and we were ordered out, we found we had been taken to Riga, which is the capital city of Latvia. May I please have the first slide? Can you manage the first slide? Well, we have walked into a ghetto in Riga. The next one, please. Here we are. This shows you the distance we've been taking, around 1,000 miles. Bottom left is the town in which I was born and where we lived, Kassel. Top right, the arrow points at Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, as I said. We were marched into a ghetto which had been built by the Nazis. They occupied Riga around July 1941, immediately set up this ghetto and then forced all around 30,000 Riga Jews to leave their homes and move into this ghetto, which was grossly, grossly overcrowded. I have a map on the next slide of the Riga ghetto, and you will see it is quite a small area, just a few streets, and around 30,000 Jews were packed into that tiny area. Families had to share rooms. They were so small. All this happened in August 1941. In November, the Nazis carried out an extraordinary massacre, murdering all 30,000 of these Jews. By lying to them and telling them that they were being taken to another camp, they took them in groups into a nearby forest where they had prepared 3 enormous pits. And as each group of these Riga Jews approached, they were murdered by machine gun fire, and they either fell into or were thrown into one of these pits. The ghetto was now completely empty, and within a matter of 2 weeks or so, transports of German Jews arrived to repopulate the ghetto. We were transport, I believe, number 5. So the ghetto was pretty empty when we arrived. Nevertheless, a very limited number of houses was opened, and we were crammed into this house. Again, people had to share rooms. That was necessary for anyone to have a roof over their heads. The Nazis immediately put us on a starvation diet. They also informed us that we no longer had names. Each one of us was given a number. And for the rest of the 3.5 years that I spent in a number of different camps, I was never referred to by name, always by that number, which it was important to remember, because forgetting it often resulted in physical punishment. I will never forget my number, 46578. People were told that they were being organized into work groups who were sent out to work in factories. All the work that was demanded of them was to help the German war effort. They worked in factories manufacturing bullets, small arms. There was one factory, I believe, where even parts for aeroplanes were being manufactured. As I said, everything to help the Germans fight the war. Children under the age of 13 in that camp were excused from work. I now had to look after my little brother. I was aged 11, he was 7. My mother had to go out to work all day long. We were at a loose end all day long. We often got into trouble, children left unsupervised. It was not only my brother and I, there were quite a number of other children around at a loose end. There was among our group who were deported, a remarkable gentleman who was a teacher in the Jewish school I had attended in Germany before it was forcibly shut down. His name was Herr Bacher. I never knew his first name. We had respect for our teachers, and we also always addressed them as Herr Bacher, which means Mr. Bacher, his surname. He pleaded with the camp authorities to be given the use of one room where he could assemble all the children from Kassel and attempt to teach them only from knowledge he had in his mind. He had no facilities to run a school. There were no school books, pens, pencil, paper, blackboards, nothing of that sort. Eventually, he received permission, and we were told to report to that room daily. It didn't work very well because he separated us into different age groups to whom he could speak at the time, and the rest of the children got unruly and disturbed. That meant the attempt. So, being a resourceful man and also multi-talented, he formed us all into a large choir and taught us Hebrew melodies of our prayers, which we sing in shul, like Adon Olam, Yigdal, various other prayers. You know, the prayer that we say Friday night, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat. And we were quite a good choir. Eventually, my 12th birthday came and passed, and he approached me and he said to me, I know it's normally the father's duty to ensure that the son has a bar mitzvah, but I know your father is not here with you, so would you like me to help you? I can tell you, with just a small tinge of embarrassment perhaps, that I had no idea what he meant. I didn't know what a bar mitzvah meant. I hadn't had any schooling since I was 8.5 or so. My father was not with me, but I was a good boy, good in inverted commas, and my reply to him was, yes, please, Mr. Habacher. So he had to calculate mentally. He didn't have a Hebrew calendar, but he had to calculate what he assumed, or not assumed, but calculated to be my bar mitzvah Shabbat in order to teach me the correct parasha. Well, he began teaching me, and I was quite quick on the uptake. So instead of just teaching me one portion, like Shilishi or Chamishi, he taught me the whole parsha from beginning to end. It was Parshas Tzav. And remarkably, we also had a Sefer Torah, several Sifrei Torah in the camp. This came about because when the Uyghur Jews were forced to move into the ghetto, there are also Rabbonim among those people. And several of these Rabbonim, who were rabbis of the local synagogues, took with them into the camp in Sifrei Torah. Each one took one. When they were forced to march into the forest to be murdered, they were not allowed to take any items with them. And when we were housed in the same accommodation, we found everything they'd left behind, including these Sifrei Torah. So this teacher, Habacher, got hold of one Sefer Torah, and although everyone was going out to work daily, he really managed to perform a miracle, because there were 9 men assembled, and I was proud to be counted as number 10 on that Shabbat. And we had a Shabbat morning minyan, an Orthodox traditional minyan. And when it came to Kriyat HaTorah, I learned the whole parsha as he had taught me. And he had also taught me Maftir, which I did. And it was an astounding experience for me. I have never attended a single service in the camp before, nor did I attend any service in any of the other camps during the remaining 3.5 years. This was the only religious service I experienced, and that was my bar mitzvah in the camp. I will never ever forget this gentleman, who sadly did not survive. But mentally, I'm indebted to him and think the world of him. He had been in this camp for just about 3 months, and one day we were stopped from going to work, and instead, in groups, we were taken into a nearby hall, at the far end of which sat an SS officer at a desk or table, and we had to shuffle forward single file until each one of us stood in front of him. He would glance at the person standing there, and usually without saying a word, point left or right. At the time, we didn't realize it meant live or die. And people were so naive that sometimes when parents were pointed in one direction and their grown-up children in the other, because it soon became evident that all the elderly people were pointed in one direction and the younger, stronger people in the other. Sometimes these children had the courage to ask the SS man to allow them to join their parents on the other side, little knowing that in practice they were committing suicide by volunteering to do this, because it soon became apparent what the fate of these people was. The Nazis lied and said that these elderly people were being sent to another camp where the work would be less demanding. But in fact, days later, truckloads of clothing was delivered to the camp, and a group of inmates was set up to sort the clothing. Some of these sorters actually recognized items of clothing which had been worn by their loved ones when they were sent away. And it became crystal clear that they had in fact been forced to strip before being murdered. And this clothing was now being sorted prior to being sent back, distributed to needy Germans. We learned of this massacre from around 30 young Latvian men who were spared. And the reason for this was that they were all fluent German speakers. And they were appointed sort of internal camp police. And they told us firsthand that this is what had happened to these Latvian Jews whose residences we were now occupying. But that was not the only way the Germans managed to murder people. While people were working in these factories, which incidentally did not happen to be there by chance, but many large German industrial firms had been persuaded to specifically build factories close to these camps. Many camps all over Eastern Europe had these factories by being promised an unlimited supply of slave labor, which of course made it very profitable for these firms, and they obliged. And while people were working in these factories, our guards had been instructed to keep a close eye observing people, and unfortunate individuals who began to weaken because of the 7-day-a-week, hard, long days of work, the lack of hygiene, the starvation diet began to lose strength. Once the guards realized that someone was weakened to an extent where they could not perform the solid day's work expected by the Nazis, they were taken aside, taken to what was called an execution site, where they were shot and their bodies thrown into a mass grave. May I please have the next slide? Here you see a group of people being taken under guard to work in one of these factories. And the next slide, here you see someone who has weakened and can no longer perform as the Nazis required, being dragged by Latvian soldiers to that execution site. This must have been taken by one of the guards, this photograph, and almost certainly within hours, possibly less than hours after this photo was taken, that unfortunate Jewish man who was being dragged had lost his life, was murdered. Incidentally, in this camp, practically all our guards were Latvian Nazis who had volunteered for this. They hated Jews just as much as the Nazis did, and were just as brutal to us. So, this is how life was in the ghetto. But time does not permit me to spend too much time on telling you about this camp, except to tell you that in August 1943, during the morning assembly, which was a regular thing every morning, and people were divided into groups to go to work, we were told to remain standing to attention, and a section of us, which included both my mother and us two boys, were among a group of people who were told they were being sent to another camp. We were packed into cattle wagons, the doors were locked, and we set off on a journey again into the unknown. No information, no destination was given to us. We were taken to a purpose-built labor camp, which contained only a huge number of barracks, filled with 3-tier bunk beds, and each one of us was allocated a bed, and that became our home. It was a labor camp where everyone had to work. I was then age 13, I was selected to work. There were 4 young children, including my brother, who were excused work and were permitted to stay in the camp during the day. Many people again worked in factories, but my mother and I became part of a slave labor gang who were marched each day to a nearby very busy railway junction, which the Allies had begun bombing. We had to dig up the bombed rails, level the ground, and lay new rails to make it serviceable again. And at night we were marched back into the camp, where we were reunited with our children, including we were reunited with my brother. May I please have the next photograph? On the right, you see a photograph of my brother. One day we returned from work and the children had disappeared. We were frantic, we had no idea what was going on. Eventually, a member of the kitchen staff, who was one of the very few people in the camp during the day, told us that 2 SS men had come into the camp, said they had orders to take these children and had taken them away. And to this day, although searching over a period of decades post-war for any information on my brother's fate, we have absolutely no return, no information on him was found. The day he was taken, he disappeared off the world. In this camp, there was no time for mourning. The next morning, my mother and I had to line up and march out to work to repair those damaged railway lines in order to stay alive. He had another experience in this camp, another mass selection, and this one, as we entered the hall, we were ordered to strip naked and then had to shuffle forward to face another dreaded SS man. As we shuffled forward, the man immediately behind me whispered to me, if by chance he asks you your age, say you're 17. And indeed, as I stood there facing the SS man, he asked me my age, and as I had been prompted, I replied 17. He pointed me in the direction of those surviving. My mother, Olea Schoven, sadly was not so lucky, and she was pointed in the other direction. By then, people were no longer naive, and people realized being pointed in that direction meant they would almost certainly be murdered before the day was out. We had to leave the hall by different doors and each one join our respective groups. I had barely reached my group when those from the condemned side, a small group of them, began racing across quite suddenly to join us, to mingle among our group and sort of thereby save their lives. The guards intervened and then began searching through our group to drag people back to the condemned side. While this was going on, I spotted that my mother had been one of those racing across, and she was sort of hiding among us. Fortunately, she was not recognized, and she managed to save her life that day, and in fact survived to be liberated together with me a little under a year after this event. Shortly after this selection, we were packed into cattle trucks and again sent off into the unknown. We ended up in a concentration camp called Stutthof. Stutthof, incidentally, when we had gone through this selection, we did not get the clothing we had worn back. Instead, we were issued with a type of convict clothing, of which I have an example on the next slide, if you would kindly display it, please. This type of striped clothing was given to us, and this we wore day and night, 24 hours a day, from that day until the day of our liberation. In Stutthof, Stutthof was a concentration camp, which even then, the entrance gate was known as the Death Gate. May I have the next slide, please? This is the Death Gate. It is known to this day as the Death Gate of Stutthof, because in practice, when you entered Stutthof through that gate, it was a death sentence. Very few people left Stutthof alive. It was initially not an extermination camp so much as an intense, a brutal labor camp. People were worked to death, and they no longer had the strength to work. That was a death sentence. We, the group of 300 who had been working at the railway junction, were told that we were in Stutthof just in transit, and we became the envy of the camp because we would be leaving Stutthof alive. Indeed, after 3 weeks there, we left Stutthof and were sent to another labor camp, which again had a busy junction, a railway junction, and we were set to do exactly the same work. We had by now a year's experience of doing this work, and we had become a valuable labor source for the Nazis, because these railway junctions were vital in their effort to supply and reinforce the front line fighting for the Nazis on the Russian front. So we were doing vital work for the Nazis, and that possibly saved our lives. The Starvation Diet was in this camp even worse than it had been in the other camps. And the rumor went around the camp that some of the many trains which passed through the junction, and many stopped and had wagons uncoupled from one train coupled to another, contained food destined for the German Nazi soldiers. And one night, a group of men from our camp broke the seal on one of these wagons, found some food, and of course took it to satisfy their craving hunger. The Nazis, in revenge, raided our camp and took away 8 men. They then set about using slave labor, erecting enormous gallows, and one day we all had to assemble around the gallows and watch these 8 men being hanged one by one as punishment for what had happened, and to terrify us into obeying German orders. We were in this camp for around 6 months, then packed into cattle trucks, transported without food or water or even sanitation on some of these journeys. The stench was unbelievable in these wagons. They were sealed cattle wagons with roofs, doors shut, barely any ventilation, just through cracks in the wagons. We were moved to another camp where on the first morning, the SS officer inspecting us looked at me and said to me, "When everyone is dismissed, you stay." I began trembling because one of the worst things to happen was to be noticed. Safety lay in anonymity, and of course, I was no longer anonymous. He came up to me when everyone had been taken off in groups to work, asked me to follow him, took me to his accommodation, and appointed me as his personal slave, his Batman, he said. I had a long list of things I had to do in his apartment every morning, every day, like polishing all his many pairs of knee-length boots, brushing his many uniforms, officers' uniforms, make his bed, wash his breakfast things, wash the floor, all sorts of a long list of items I had to do for him. And of course, I realized my life lay entirely in his hands. His power over us was absolute. If he pulled out his gun, shot me, there would have been no repercussions for him. So I did my very best, trembling as I worked, day after day. Fortunately, I survived for the 3 weeks we were in this camp. After 3 weeks, we were sent off by cattle truck. This time we were packed so tightly that we had to stand. There was no room to sit even. When people fainted, or as some people did, when people died, they couldn't fall down because pressure of people around kept them stand upright. We were taken back to the concentration camp of Stutthof for the second time, but this time not in transit. Stutthof had been enlarged a year or so earlier, and during this enlargement, they had built a gas chamber and a crematorium into the camp, which it did not have before. Transports of Jews from the east kept arriving. Some of them were registered into the camp, and other train loads were taken, every single person on that train load, straight to the gas chamber and had lost their lives within hours. The crematorium could not burn the bodies at the rate they were killing people, so the excess were just piled up out in the open and periodically set on fire. Food was worse than ever. Sometimes there was insufficient food. Those who were at the rear of the queue didn't get any. Every night in our barrack, people died lying in their bunk beds. We were now so cramped that there were at least 2 people sharing a bunk bed. The bodies were taken out every morning to be laid out in the open, and some Jews had to push a cart picking up these bodies, take them to the crematorium. My mother was in a separate adjoining camp for women. We couldn't see each other. Neither of us knew whether the other was still alive. Until one day in April 45, one morning, a group of us was selected to stand aside, formed into a long column, and the same thing happened in the women's camp next to us. And we were each given a chunk of bread, and under armed SS guards marched out of the camp. And we were told that we had to keep marching. We did. The men's and women's column merged, and I began searching around the column to see whether I could possibly find my mother. She likewise began searching for me. And after I don't know how long, we were overjoyed to find each other. Both of us had been selected for this march, which turned into a death march. There were hundreds of these death marches, and many, many people lost their lives just days before liberation. We marched along for a long time. Anyone who could not keep pace and began trailing behind was shot mercilessly by the guards. We reached a small port. We were loaded onto 4 barges, ancient wooden barges. 4 tugs manned by SS teams then appeared and towed these 4 barges out to sea. We were at sea for 6 days, and each day at some point, an SS officer would appear and select victims from among us to be dragged onto the deck and thrown into the sea to drown. They said they were using too much fuel towing us. This happened every single of the 6 days. Every second day, the Nazi barges would disappear for a while. I don't know whether it was to get a decent meal or to refuel, but they reappeared after a relatively short time. On day 7, they disappeared as they had done previously, but did not return. Remarkably, among our group, there were a smallish number of prisoners of war who, because of the Red Cross intervention, had been fed a better diet in the camps, and they therefore had more strength. A group of them clambered on deck, managed to dislodge, to rip off some wooden planks, and formed themselves into a rowing team and attempted to row our barge containing more or less 1,000 people towards shore. We could see the shore. We were not very far from shore, probably half a kilometer or so. And quite remarkably, after a while, they had managed to turn the barge to face the shore, and it began to move infinitesimally slowly. We couldn't see any of this. We were stuck at the bottom of the barge, but messages kept being passed around telling us what was happening. And very, very slowly, the barge began to move towards shore. They rowed until they were utterly exhausted, but by then other people had been enthused and took their part, so that there were teams taking turns. And this rowing effort went on for many hours, right through the day, into the night, and through most of the night before the barge ran aground. Those who still had an ounce of strength began clambering onto the top deck and had to jump into the water and then wade ashore. Many people were just too exhausted, too weak, or perhaps had lost the will to live and stayed on board the barge. But my mother persuaded me to come with her. We went on top, jumped, and waded ashore. It was a pitch dark night. There was not a single light to be seen in any direction, no sign of habitation, just a vast expanse of sandy beach. We had no idea what to do next. A group of us went ashore. We began running around, didn't know which direction was safe. And while we were indecisive what to do next, extraordinarily, just at that time, the barges manned by the SS returned. They, of course, were livid, furious, seeing what we had done, and they divided into 2 groups. One boarded the barge, and we could hear incessant shooting. They shot every single person who had not got off. And the second lot came ashore and began rounding us up. Hearing that shooting, of course, we were convinced that we would be lined up and also shot. But no, they lined us up into a column and told us again to march. Again, people who could not keep pace were shot. And then as we were marching along, the tank column came rolling towards us. And suddenly a cry went up among our group. Look, our guards have turned and run. They recognized before we did that this was a British tank column. And just by scaring our guards into running away, they had effectively liberated us. Quite remarkably, this column of tanks did not stop. They kept rolling past us, but in doing so had liberated us. And minutes later, truckloads of British soldiers appeared, who stopped. They began handing out food to us, and then gave us time to rest, and eventually took us into the nearest town, which was called Neustadt in the Baltic Sea, around close to the Baltic Sea. And we were being taken care of. And that was our moment of liberation. Just by choosing to roll along the same road that we were marching, these tanks liberated us. Very soon, in a matter of days, both my mother and I fell ill. We were taken to hospital. Then I spent a long period in convalescent home because I had not only typhus, I also was found to have tuberculosis in a lung. We were interviewed by welfare officers, gave details, whatever we had of my father. He began searching for us through the chief rabbi who organized this in London. Eventually, they managed to connect us. He was not allowed to come and see us. He applied for us to come and join him. It took until September 46 before we received permission to come to the UK. We were reunited in September 1946, a bittersweet reunion because my younger brother was missing. But that effectively is the moment I really began living when I entered the UK. I had lost 7 years of education, but at the assistance of my parents, my father was a pauper. He had volunteered for the British Army and eventually he was invalided out. But being an alien, he was restricted to taking a job helping the British war effort, and he ended up working as a painter, renovating houses which had been damaged by Allied bombing, but by Nazi bombing, but were not destroyed. They could be renovated and the tenants or owners could move back in. He did this work for the rest of the war, earning a pittance. And despite the fact that money was in an extremely short supply in our household, my parents deprived themselves of many things to give me a chance to have some private education. I was too old to go to school, being 16, and I managed to very, very slowly, gradually. I learned English very fast by attending a crash course in English which was organized for refugees, and then attended a private college to try and catch up on some of my lost education. Eventually, 8 years after I arrived, I managed to attend to be accepted to study at university, and I ended up with a degree in electronics, which became my way of earning my living. I am eternally grateful to this country for the generosity of allowing us to settle here, live a free life. I married a wonderful lady. We have children and grandchildren. And although no one can logically explain why this calamity happened to us, I also have reason to be grateful to Almighty God for having given me the opportunity to lead the life I did lead. I'd better stop here to give you a chance to ask some questions. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Mr. Goldberg, thank you so much for sharing your personal story with us. We're just so grateful for being able to hear firsthand from you your unimaginable experiences. And we said at the beginning that you felt an obligation to to make known what the Holocaust really means, and having listened to you for nearly an hour solid, it just spellbound by what you experienced, what you and your family went through during the Holocaust. And you know, this is the second time I've had the privilege to hear you speak and hear, I said, your unimaginable experiences, and the impact is not lessened hearing it a second time. I could listen to you again and again and again. It's just heartrending to hear it, and it's so powerful as well. And I think it makes us all realize how fortunate we all are to be able to live freely without persecution, to be able to express our Jewish identity in safety and security, to be able to celebrate being Jewish, and particularly for this group, please God, their upcoming bar mitzvahs. I noted when you said that your bar mitzvah parsha with Tzav, the way I wrote it in script actually spells out, if you look at it, it actually looks like the number 13. So appropriate to be speaking to the club at 13 as well. We cannot thank you enough for, again, taking your time to speak to us. We do have, you very generously offered to answer any questions anyone has. So if anybody has any questions, please just unmute yourself and ask. While we're waiting for anyone to be brave enough, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, Ms. Goldberg, if that's okay. I know you met with the Duchess of Cambridge, and she praised the bravery of you and others to continue sharing their story. Can you tell a little bit about that experience?
Yes. When I came to this country in 1946, I decided that I wanted, if at all possible, to build a normal, forward-looking life. And as a result, I never ever set foot ever again in Germany or Poland or Latvia or Lithuania, in any of these countries where I had been imprisoned in camps, until, believe it or not, 72 years later, back in 2017, I was contacted and told that the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge are visiting the concentration camp of Stutthof, and they had expressed a desire to meet some Jewish survivors. While on this visit, my friend Ziggy Schipper, who I met in 1944 when we were both 14-year-old, we worked for the same slave labor camp, the Labor Gang. And he also came to the UK. We have been friends ever since, for all these many years. I saw him only a couple of weeks ago. He and I were asked as survivors of Stutthof to meet the royal couple. I can tell you they're the most charming people imaginable. We had been drilled on how to address, how to behave towards royalty, but within a matter of a minute or two, they put us completely at ease. And we spent around 1 hour together with them, just the four of us, very private meeting. No reporter, no official was allowed to come close to us. It's just between us four. We have a small commemoration. There is two memorials, a Jewish memorial, and there are also many non-Jews killed in the camp. So there is a non-Jewish memorial, one on either side of the gas chamber. Both the gas chamber and the crematorium survived intact, quite remarkably. In most camps, the Germans managed to demolish them before the Allies in order to remove evidence of their atrocities, but these have completely survived intact, which makes me really wonder greatly how so many people can speak about Holocaust denial. All they have to do is go to Stutthof, which is open to the public. They can see a gas chamber and a crematorium exactly as it was then. You walk into the crematorium, which the Duke and Duchess did together with us, and you see the ovens there. All you need to do is press a button and they're ready to continue their deadly work of burning human beings. As a result of this visit, the royal couple were so deeply impressed. It was their first glimpse and first contact with Holocaust survivors. The exhibition in the camp is sanitized, but what they heard from us was the real thing of what life was like back in 1944, 45, when we were there. And I've had an opportunity of meeting the Duchess again at the beginning of last year, in last January, and on Zoom because of COVID restrictions. And she told me then that the conversation we had when we met some 4 years plus ago is really still in her mind. She hasn't forgotten anything we spoke about, again confirming the impact on people hearing the first-hand testimony that they did at that time. If you can scroll forward on the images, I would like to show you a message Prince William and Princess Kate wrote into the VIP visitors book at Stuttgart before they left. Can you please roll forward on the images? No? If you can go back one, please. Oh, maybe.
That's the only one. That's the only one I have.
Okay. The one before shows us speaking to the Duke and Duchess, and the main reason I wanted to show it to you, oh, there it is. That's the one I meant. The photograph on the left, I'm not showing it in order to show off having met royalty. That grey building on the back where you see the large chimney going up, that is the crematorium. As you can see, it's standing there to this day. And to the left of it, out of the picture, is the gas chamber, fairly close to it. And close to the gas chamber is the memorial at which we, all four of us, paid homage to the many tens of thousands of people who were murdered in this camp. If you can move forward now to the image, that's it. I wanted to show you the message the Duke and Duchess had written into the VIP book. You can see it's signed William and Catherine. Just read that and please take it to heart. You see what he said? All of us have an overwhelming responsibility to make sure that we learn the lessons and that the horror of the Holocaust is never repeated. My final message to you is just to quote to you a wise saying that evil triumphs only when good people remain silent. Silence never helps the oppressed, it always helps the oppressor. So please remember as you grow into manhood, when you witness discrimination, do not remain silent. That sadly is how the Holocaust developed. It didn't happen overnight. It was a combination of indifference of the population who knew the injustices being perpetrated, but keeping silent. By the time they were ready to speak up and protest, it was too late. So,
Thank you. That's yes, such an important message. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes. Sorry. Hi. Hello, Manfred. I'm Brandon, and this is Hayden. Thank you very much for the very interesting and moving discussion story. Just a question with regards to the Allies and their involvement. Obviously, it took about 6 years, roughly, for them to actually act. Why do you think it did take so long, bearing in mind that obviously word would have got out during those 6 years to them? I mean, obviously, with the atrocities that happened during that time, that period, we hope that they will never ever happen ever again. And obviously, now all the Allied countries will act in advance and do something about it. But what are your thoughts with regards to that? Why it took so long for them to actually do anything, and could it potentially have been avoided, or some of the war have been avoided if they had acted earlier than they did?
I mentioned to you that between 1933 and 1939, the Nazis in Germany still permitted Jews to leave. It was just their assets that they grabbed and confiscated. And if countries had opened their borders then to allow Jews refuge, entry, many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews could have been saved. The Germans initially just wanted to rid themselves of Jews, to make the country and all the countries they occupied what is called Judenrein, free of Jews. The world was deaf. I told you there was this international conference in France in 1938. It was a talking shop. Each country was keen to help Jews, but yes, that they would be very sympathetic if other countries opened their borders. And each country claimed the same, that the result was that nothing was achieved. That's one aspect. The other is, I have been told, and I tend to believe it, because I've been told by people who claim to know, that during the war, when the atrocities, particularly Auschwitz, by far the largest and most deadly of all the camps, became known, they pleaded with Winston Churchill to bomb the railway lines leading into Auschwitz, because that was the way Jews were transported to Auschwitz en masse. I told you that the Nazis put us to work to repair the railway lines, showing the importance of rail transport, but it wouldn't have completely stopped, but interrupted and minimized the rate at which Jews could be murdered. But Winston Churchill was unmovable. He said, "We are fighting a war. We cannot spare the effort required." He was asked, I believe, more than once, and that was his stock answer, that the Allies could not afford to divert aeroplanes to attack the railway system around Auschwitz to stop people being transported by the thousands. And lack of sympathy by the leaders of these countries must be a major part of, because where there's a will, there is a way. Not all Jews could have been saved, but a number running into many tens of thousands could well have been saved by these means, had the will been there.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So can I just ask a question? First of all, thank you so much for sharing your a remarkable story. You clearly lived through horrendous time year after year. Can I just ask whether there's one or more things that sort of kept you going during that time, during the war, to help you to survive?
Well, let me put it this way. Fairly recently, for some reason, I don't know why, I counted the number of days I spent in the camps, and I've made it a total of 1,234 days incarcerated in 6 different camps. 1,234 days, and I think I must be the most prolific jackpot winner, because in the camps, effectively, the way I put it, each day was a lottery. Each morning, you did not know whether you would still be alive that evening. There was not a day when numerous, very many people who were alive in the morning, they're no longer alive in the evening. And having won the lottery in that way 1,234 times must have been well, the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One could do one's best not to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to become sort of invisible, unnoticed. My mother, Leah Sholem, I remember drilling into me when I was a youngster, 11 years old, and we were taken into the camps. She said to me, I've forgotten how many times, try to act in a way that you will not be noticed. And I began taking that to heart and did my best to do that. When I was working, doing anything, I always did my very best in order not to draw attention to myself. And that is how I think of it now. We haven't really got time, otherwise I would sort of really try and explain to you how I developed faith in the Almighty after all my experiences, because I know the vast majority of survivors became totally secular post-liberation. Initially, I was more or less among them, but I was not persuaded. It was my own sort of mind that began urging me to investigate, and slowly but surely brought me back into becoming a faithful and believing and practicing Jew.
Thank you.
We have time for just maybe one more question.
Sorry.
If there are no more questions, then again, just want to thank Mr. Goldberg again. And Mr. Goldberg explained his meeting with the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. He's also had another brush with royalty. There's this week, which just came out in the news, that Mr. Goldberg, together with some other Holocaust survivors, Prince Charles has commissioned a number of portraits of Holocaust survivors that will be displayed in Buckingham Palace. And Mr. Goldberg has had his portrait done, and there's going to be a documentary, I understand, on BBC Two. Is that correct?
That's right. The BBC made a film of this, which will be shown on BBC Two, 27th of January, 9 p.m. I am speechless to realize that I was privileged to have been chosen to take part in this unique project.
Well, Mr. Goldberg, it's been a privilege for us to hear from you today. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts. We really, really appreciate you sharing your unimaginable personal experiences with us. We wish you and your family only good health and good things in the future. And we really, really appreciate you taking your time once again to speak to us.
Thank you very much.
Keep well. Take care. And thank you everyone for joining us again this morning. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you. Take good care of yourselves, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.